"Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. That car's been reported stolen." The words cut through the warm Georgia afternoon like a siren nobody else could hear yet. Traffic slowed along Peachtree Street as a patrol cruiser sat behind a sleek black Mercedes with its red and blue lights flashing rhythmically against the glass buildings nearby. A few drivers rolled down their windows, curiosity drifting through the humid air like steam rising from hot pavement. Officer Derek Collins stepped out of his cruiser with the slow confidence of a man who believed the badge on his chest gave him the final word in any situation. His boots tapped against the asphalt as he approached the driver's side, one hand resting casually near his radio, while the other gestured sharply toward the tinted window. Inside the Mercedes, the woman behind the wheel didn't move immediately. Angela Brooks had been driving home after a long afternoon downtown, the kind of quiet drive people take to clear their minds after hours of meetings and paperwork. The city lights reflected softly off the polished hood of her car, and for a moment the entire scene felt oddly suspended, like the world itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Angela lowered the window slowly, the soft electric hum barely audible over the distant sound of traffic. She looked up at the officer standing beside her door, calm eyes meeting his with the kind of steady composure that comes from years of learning how to keep control of a situation. "Good afternoon, officer," she said evenly. Collins didn't return the courtesy. His eyes swept across the interior of the vehicle before settling back on her face, skepticism etched into every line of his expression. "License and registration," he said. Angela reached toward the console, retrieving her documents with measured movements. The faint rustle of paper was almost lost beneath the growing murmur of slowed traffic around them. A delivery truck crept past at barely 10 miles an hour, the driver leaning slightly out his window for a better look. Collins glanced at the Mercedes emblem on the steering wheel, then back at Angela. Something in his expression hardened. "Mind telling me where you got this car?" he asked. Angela blinked once, the question hanging between them like a cloud that hadn't yet decided whether to break into a storm. "It's mine," she replied calmly. Collins let out a short laugh under his breath. Not amused, not friendly, just dismissive. "That's interesting," he said. "Because this model was flagged in a report earlier today." Angela tilted her head slightly. "A report?" Collins nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Vehicle matching this description. Possible theft." The word theft landed heavier than the summer air pressing down on the street. A few pedestrians on the sidewalk had stopped walking altogether now, phones subtly lifting. Angela noticed them, but didn't react. She kept her eyes on the officer in front of her. "Officer," she said carefully, "there must be some mistake." Collins straightened, the sunlight catching the polished metal of his badge. "Step out of the car." Angela remained seated for a second longer, studying him with the quiet patience of someone who had spent a lifetime watching people underestimate her. The air felt thicker now. Somewhere nearby a horn sounded impatiently. Collins tapped the roof of the car with two firm knuckles. "Ma'am, I'm not asking again." Angela exhaled slowly and opened the door. The faint scent of warm asphalt drifted upward as she stepped onto the street. She stood calmly beside the car, the afternoon sun reflecting softly off the windshield behind her. Collins looked her up and down, then glanced again at the luxury sedan. The assumption had already settled firmly in his mind, and he spoke as though the conclusion had already been reached. "You know," he said, shaking his head slightly, "people always think they can get away with things like this." Angela folded her hands loosely in front of her. "With respect, officer," she replied, her voice steady and measured. "You're making a very serious assumption." Collins met her gaze, the faintest hint of irritation flashing across his face. "No," he said. "I'm doing my job." Angela looked past him briefly at the flashing patrol lights, then back at the officer who believed he had already solved the case standing in front of him. And in that quiet moment on the side of a busy American street, Officer Derek Collins had absolutely no idea that the woman he had just ordered out of her own car was one of the most powerful legal authorities in the entire state. The flashing patrol lights painted the afternoon in pulses of red and blue while the steady hum of traffic rolled slowly past them. Angela Brooks stood beside her car with a calm posture, her hands resting loosely at her sides as if this were simply another pause in an ordinary day. Officer Derek Collins circled the Mercedes once, his eyes scanning the vehicle with the careful suspicion of someone determined to prove his first instinct correct. The glossy black paint reflected the skyline of downtown Atlanta like a mirror, and the chrome trim caught the sunlight in brief flashes that seemed almost too bright for the tension gathering in the air. A few yards away, a man in a baseball cap leaned against the door of his pickup truck and quietly lifted his phone, pretending to check a message while the camera pointed toward the scene. Another driver slowed to a crawl before continuing down the block, curiosity spreading through the street like a ripple across water. Collins stopped near the front of the car and glanced back at Angela, his expression firm and unmoved. "You said this vehicle belongs to you," he stated, as if repeating the claim made it easier to challenge. Angela nodded once. "Yes, officer." Collins studied her face for a moment longer before looking down at the registration she had handed him earlier. The paper rested between his fingers while the faint sound of a police radio crackled from his shoulder. "This is a very expensive car," he said slowly. "People usually remember where they got something like this." Angela met his gaze again, her voice steady and respectful. "I remember exactly where I got it." Collins did not respond right away. Instead, he walked toward the passenger side and peered through the window, as though the interior of the car might reveal a hidden explanation that the paperwork did not. The quiet click of his boots against the pavement echoed slightly between the buildings lining the street. The moment stretched long enough that even the breeze seemed to hesitate. Angela remained still, watching him with patient composure. For her, the situation was not unfamiliar. She had seen moments like this before, moments when a person decided who someone must be before asking who they actually were. Collins eventually returned to the driver's side and folded the documents once in his hand. "You know what usually happens when someone is driving a vehicle that matches a theft report," he said. "We sort it out at the station." Angela raised her eyebrows slightly, the calm in her voice never wavering. "Officer Collins, there is no reason to take this any further." Collins stiffened just enough to notice the way she had said his name. "How do you know my name?" he asked quickly. Angela nodded toward the badge on his chest. "It is written right there." A faint murmur rose from the sidewalk, where two pedestrians had stopped walking entirely now. Collins glanced briefly toward them before turning his attention back to Angela. His jaw tightened, as though the growing audience made him more determined to finish what he had started. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharpening, "I need you to answer my questions directly." Angela gave a small, controlled breath. "I already have." Collins gestured toward the car again. "Then explain why a vehicle just like this one appeared in a report earlier today." Angela looked at the Mercedes for a moment, the sunlight reflecting across the windshield like a sheet of glass. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same steady confidence it had from the beginning. "Because sometimes reports are wrong." Collins shook his head slowly, as if dismissing the possibility entirely. "Reports do not usually get things that wrong." Angela studied him quietly, noticing the certainty in his posture and the rigid line of authority in the way he stood. Around them, the street felt strangely quiet despite the traffic continuing to pass only a few yards away. Somewhere behind the patrol car, another phone lifted slightly higher to capture a clearer view. Collins slipped the registration into his pocket for the moment and reached toward the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch," he began, pressing the button. Angela watched him carefully now, understanding exactly how quickly small assumptions could turn into something much larger. The officer paused halfway through the call and glanced back at her once more, as if giving her one final opportunity to change the story he had already decided to believe. "Last chance," he said. "If there is something you want to tell me before this goes further, now would be the time." Angela looked directly at him, her expression composed and almost thoughtful. "Officer," she replied gently, "you are about to learn something very important about assumptions." Collins frowned slightly, uncertain whether the calm in her voice was confidence or simply stubbornness. The red and blue lights continued flashing behind him, and the small crowd watching from the street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever would happen next. Officer Derek Collins kept his finger on the radio button for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Angela Brooks standing beside the car. The flashing patrol lights continued to pulse across the street, reflecting in the glass windows of nearby buildings and across the polished surface of the Mercedes. The city around them carried on with its usual rhythm, but the space between the officer and the woman had grown unusually still, like the quiet center of a storm that had not fully arrived yet. Collins lowered his hand from the radio without speaking into it, his curiosity now mixing with the stubborn certainty he had been holding on to since the moment he saw the vehicle. "You seem very confident for someone in this situation," he said slowly. Angela did not look away. "Confidence does not come from the situation," she replied calmly. "It comes from knowing the truth." Collins exhaled through his nose and shifted his weight slightly. Behind him, a dark sedan rolled past at no more than 5 miles per hour, the driver's head turning just enough to catch the scene before continuing down the block. A few people on the sidewalk had not moved at all now. They were watching openly, phones held casually in front of them, as if recording had become the natural response to any unusual moment in a city street. Collins gestured toward the car again. "You are telling me this car belongs to you, yet the description lines up perfectly with a vehicle flagged earlier today." Angela's expression remained composed, but her voice carried a subtle firmness now. "Officer Collins, I am telling you that the vehicle belongs to me and that the report you mentioned does not apply here." Collins took one slow step closer, the sunlight catching the edges of his badge again. "Then help me understand something," he said. "Why would someone report a car just like this one?" Angela paused briefly before answering. "Because people sometimes see what they expect to see." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than either of them anticipated. Collins frowned slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" Angela looked at him thoughtfully for a moment, as if deciding how much explanation was necessary. "It means assumptions can travel faster than facts," she said. Collins folded his arms loosely across his chest, the posture signaling that he was no longer simply checking paperwork but defending the judgment he had already made. "Well, facts are exactly what I am trying to get here," he replied. Angela nodded once. "Then perhaps you should start with the facts you already have." Collins glanced down briefly toward the registration again before looking back at her. "All right," he said. "Let us talk about facts. The registration says the owner of this vehicle is Angela Brooks." Angela lifted her chin slightly. "That is correct." Collins watched her closely. "And you are telling me that you are Angela Brooks?" "Yes." Collins tilted his head a fraction, skepticism returning to his expression. "You expect me to accept that without verification?" Angela gave a faint, almost amused smile. "Verification is exactly what I recommend." Collins hesitated, the smallest crack appearing in the certainty that had guided him up to that point. He glanced again at the car, then at the paperwork in his hand, then back at Angela. The pieces of the situation were all in front of him, yet they did not quite fit together the way he had expected when he first turned on his patrol lights. The quiet crowd watching from a distance seemed to sense the shift as well. A young man near the curb lowered his phone slightly, whispering something to the friend standing beside him. Collins cleared his throat. "All right," he said slowly. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding, we will clear it up quickly." Angela nodded calmly. "I believe we will." Collins looked down at the name on the document one more time before speaking again. "Angela Brooks," he repeated. "Is there anything else about you that might help explain why this car appears in a report?" Angela met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said evenly. "There is." Collins waited, expecting a nervous explanation or a complicated story about a mistaken identity. Instead, Angela simply reached into the inside pocket of her jacket with a slow, deliberate motion and removed a small leather identification case. She held it closed in her hand for a moment, allowing the quiet tension between them to grow just a little longer. Collins watched the case carefully, uncertain now whether the next few seconds would confirm his suspicion or completely unravel it. Angela looked directly at him and spoke in the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. "Officer Collins," she said, "before you make another assumption, I believe you should take a closer look at this." Angela Brooks held the leather identification case in her hand for a moment longer, allowing the quiet tension on the street to deepen before she slowly opened it. The small movement seemed almost ordinary, yet the effect it had on the atmosphere around them was immediate. Officer Derek Collins leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing to the badge and credentials resting inside the case. The polished seal reflected the afternoon sunlight, and beneath it the words were printed clearly enough that there was no confusion about what he was looking at. For a brief second Collins did not speak. The hum of traffic returned to his ears, as if the city itself had suddenly remembered how to breathe. Angela remained perfectly still, holding the identification so he could read it without obstruction. "Take your time," she said calmly. Collins blinked once as the meaning of the words on the card settled into place inside his mind. The name matched the registration in his hand. Angela Brooks, State Attorney. The title carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. He glanced from the identification to Angela and then back again, the certainty he had carried moments earlier slipping away piece by piece. Behind him, one of the people watching from the sidewalk shifted position, the faint sound of a phone camera adjusting echoing softly through the quiet air. Collins cleared his throat and straightened slightly. "This says you are the state attorney," he said carefully, as if saying it aloud might somehow change what he was seeing. Angela closed the case gently and slipped it back into her jacket pocket. "That is correct." Collins felt a small pulse of heat rise behind his collar. He looked again at the Mercedes, then at the paperwork in his hand, then back at the woman standing calmly beside the car. Everything suddenly seemed different, as though the scene he had been certain about only minutes earlier had quietly rewritten itself without asking his permission. Angela watched the realization unfold across his face with quiet patience. She had seen that moment before in other places and with other people. The moment when confidence collided with information it had never expected to meet. Collins shifted his stance, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement. "Why did you not say that earlier?" he asked, though his voice carried less authority than it had before. Angela tilted her head slightly. "You did not ask." Collins opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused. The answer was simple enough that it left little room for argument. Around them, the small crowd watching had grown more attentive now, sensing that something important had just shifted. One man lowered his phone briefly, whispering to someone beside him before lifting it again. The flashing patrol lights continued to pulse quietly behind Collins, but they no longer felt like a symbol of control. They felt more like a spotlight that had suddenly turned in the opposite direction. Collins ran a hand briefly along the edge of his belt, searching for the confident posture he had been standing in earlier. "Well," he said slowly, "if that is the case, then we may need to review the report that led to this stop." Angela nodded once. "That would be a wise step." Collins hesitated again, realizing that the situation was no longer something he could simply resolve with a few quick assumptions. The paperwork in his hand now felt heavier than before. He glanced down at the name printed there one more time. Angela Brooks. The same name he had read minutes ago, without thinking twice about it. Angela watched him quietly, her voice calm when she spoke again. "Officer Collins," she said, "the important thing now is not the mistake itself. Mistakes happen." Collins looked up. "The important thing," she continued, "is what you choose to do once you realize it." The words settled into the space between them like a quiet challenge. Collins glanced toward his patrol car and then back toward Angela. The decision in front of him was suddenly much larger than the traffic stop he believed he had initiated. And standing there on the side of that busy Atlanta street, with the afternoon sun reflecting off the glass towers and curious onlookers watching from a distance, Officer Derek Collins began to understand that the next few choices he made would determine far more than how this traffic stop ended. Officer Derek Collins stood quietly for a moment, the sounds of the city returning around him as if someone had slowly turned the volume of the world back on. Cars continued to move through the intersection 20 yards away, engines humming, tires rolling over warm pavement. The flashing lights from his patrol car still reflected off the windows of nearby buildings, but now they felt less like authority and more like a reminder that every second of this moment was being watched. Collins glanced briefly toward the small group of people gathered along the sidewalk. 2 phones were clearly recording now. Another person stood with arms folded, watching the exchange with the kind of interest people reserve for moments that feel larger than they first appear. Collins shifted his weight again and looked back at Angela Brooks. The calm in her posture had not changed. She stood beside the Mercedes as if she had been standing there all afternoon by choice, not because a patrol car had pulled her over in the middle of downtown Atlanta. Collins let out a slow breath. "All right," he said carefully, choosing his words with more caution than before. "If you are the state attorney, then you understand that I still have a responsibility to verify information before I clear the stop." Angela nodded slightly. "Verification is reasonable," she said. "Assumptions are not." The distinction hung in the air between them. Collins looked down at the registration again, then toward the license plate on the back of the Mercedes, mentally replaying the dispatch report he had heard earlier that afternoon. The vehicle described in that alert had been similar, but now the details in his memory felt less certain than they had before. He reached up and pressed the button on his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 24, he said. The voice that answered came through the speaker a moment later, calm and routine. "Go ahead, Unit 24. Collins glanced once more at Angela before continuing. "I need confirmation on a vehicle description that was reported earlier today. Black Mercedes sedan. Checking license plate number now." He read the plate slowly and clearly, the numbers echoing softly through the radio. Angela listened without interrupting. Around them, the people watching leaned slightly closer, sensing the quiet shift in the officer's tone. Collins waited while the dispatcher checked the report. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer standing there under the bright afternoon sun. Finally, the voice returned through the radio. "Unit 24, the vehicle connected to the report was located approximately 30 minutes ago on the east side of the city. Different plate number. The suspect vehicle is already in custody." Collins blinked once. "Repeat that," he asked. "Vehicle recovered. Suspect vehicle does not match the plate you just provided." The radio clicked softly as the transmission ended. For a brief moment Collins said nothing. The answer had arrived with the kind of final clarity that left no room for interpretation. Angela watched him quietly, her expression unchanged, but the understanding in her eyes was unmistakable. Collins lowered his hand from the radio and looked toward the Mercedes again, then back at Angela Brooks. The tension that had filled the street earlier had shifted into something quieter but heavier. One of the people recording lowered his phone slightly and whispered to a friend beside him. Collins cleared his throat again, this time with more effort. "It appears the vehicle connected to the report has already been recovered," he said. Angela nodded calmly. "I suspected that might be the case." Collins hesitated before speaking again. "Which means your vehicle was not connected to that report." Angela allowed a faint smile that carried no mockery, only patience. "Correct." Collins glanced toward the patrol car lights reflecting off the pavement and then back at her. The realization had now fully settled in. What had begun as a confident stop based on a quick assumption had turned into something else entirely. Angela spoke again, her voice steady and measured. "Officer Collins, situations like this happen every day. What matters is how they are handled once the facts are clear." Collins looked at her for a long moment. The small crowd watching had grown silent now, waiting to see what he would do next. And standing there beneath the Atlanta sun, with the evidence no longer supporting the story he had believed at the start, Officer Derek Collins understood that the next words out of his mouth would say far more about him than the stop that had brought them to this moment. Officer Derek Collins stood silently for several seconds after the radio call ended, the reality of the situation settling in like a slow-moving shadow across his thoughts. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued their steady rhythm, reflecting across the dark paint of the Mercedes and casting brief pulses of red and blue across the pavement. Traffic had begun to move normally again, but the small group of people who had stopped to watch remained where they were. They had sensed that the moment unfolding on this Atlanta street had shifted from routine to something far more revealing. Collins finally looked back at Angela Brooks. The calm expression on her face had not changed since the beginning. If anything, the quiet confidence she carried seemed even more noticeable now that the facts had settled in place. Collins cleared his throat slowly. "It appears the situation was based on incorrect information," he said carefully. Angela nodded once, her voice measured and composed. "Yes, officer. It appears that way." Collins glanced briefly toward the group of onlookers. One man lowered his phone slightly, though the camera was still pointed in their direction. The officer seemed to notice it as well. For the first time since the stop began, his posture shifted from authority to reflection. "I followed the description that was broadcast earlier," Collins explained. "The vehicle matched what I believed was the report." Angela listened without interruption. When he finished speaking, she responded calmly. "And once you had the facts, you confirmed them. That part matters." Collins studied her expression for a moment, almost as if he expected criticism or anger. Instead, he found neither. The woman standing in front of him did not look like someone trying to win an argument. She looked like someone measuring a moment. Collins looked down at the registration once more before handing it back to her. "Here are your documents," he said. Angela accepted them with a small nod. Thank you. Collins hesitated again before speaking. I should also acknowledge that the stop itself was based on a mistaken assumption. Angela raised her eyebrows slightly, though her tone remained neutral. Assumptions can be powerful things. Collins exhaled quietly. Yes, they can. For a brief moment the two of them stood in silence while the city moved around them. The distant sound of a bus pulling away from the curb echoed down the block. A breeze carried the faint scent of warm asphalt and summer air. Collins glanced once more toward the people watching. The small crowd had begun whispering among themselves now. The tension of the earlier confrontation replaced by curiosity about how the officer would finish the encounter. Collins looked back at Angela Brooks. Ma'am, he said with deliberate clarity, I apologize for the inconvenience caused by this stop. Angela regarded him thoughtfully before answering. Officer Collins, what matters most is whether something is learned from moments like this. Collins nodded slowly. I understand that. Angela placed the registration back inside her vehicle through the open driver's door. The polished interior of the Mercedes reflected the sunlight softly, almost as if the car itself had remained unaffected by the tension surrounding it. Collins watched her for a moment before asking a quieter question. Do you intend to file a complaint about the stop? Angela paused before responding. That depends. Collins looked slightly uncertain. Depends on what? Angela met his gaze again. On what happens after today. The words were calm, but meaningful. Collins seemed to understand immediately. The stop itself had already become a lesson, but how it was handled afterward would determine whether it became something larger. Angela closed the driver's door gently and turned back toward him. You have an opportunity right now, officer, she said. Not just to correct a mistake, but to remember it. Collins nodded once, the seriousness of the moment now fully clear in his expression. The authority he had displayed earlier had softened into something more thoughtful. Angela opened the driver's door again and prepared to step back inside the car. Before she did, Collins spoke one more time. For what it is worth, he said quietly, I will remember it. Angela gave a small nod of acknowledgement. As she began to sit back into the driver's seat, the afternoon sun glinted off the patrol car lights one last time. And standing beside the road where the entire situation had begun, Officer Derek Collins understood that the most important part of this encounter had never been the traffic stop at all. It had been the moment when certainty met truth and left him with a choice about what kind of officer he would be from that day forward. Angela Brooks settled into the driver's seat of the Mercedes, but did not close the door immediately. The quiet pause that followed felt deliberate, as though she understood that the moment unfolding on the side of the street had not quite reached its final meaning yet. Officer Derek Collins remained standing beside the car, the afternoon sun now lower in the sky and reflecting across the glass towers of downtown Atlanta. The flashing patrol lights had finally stopped as Collins reached back earlier and switched them off, allowing the street to return to its normal rhythm. Without the lights, the scene looked less like an emergency and more like an ordinary conversation taking place beside a parked car. Yet the weight of what had just happened remained present in the air. The small crowd that had gathered nearby had begun to disperse slowly. One man lowered his phone and shook his head as he walked away. Another person leaned against a lamppost for a moment longer before continuing down the sidewalk. Moments that attract attention in a city often fade quickly once the tension passes, but the people who witness them rarely forget what they saw. Collins stood quietly, his hands resting lightly on his duty belt. For the first time since the stop began, he looked less like a man trying to prove something and more like someone processing what had already been proven. Angela glanced toward the street ahead, then back toward the officer. Before I leave, she said calmly, there is something I would like you to understand. Collins nodded slightly. I am listening. Angela rested one hand on the steering wheel, but kept her attention on him. You believed you were doing your job today, she said. And in some ways you were. Collins gave a small nod, though he did not interrupt. Angela continued in the same measured tone. But there is a difference between protecting the public and assuming who belongs in a certain place. Collins looked down briefly at the pavement before meeting her eyes again. I understand what you are saying. Angela studied him for a moment, making sure the words had truly reached him. When someone sees a car like this and immediately assumes the person driving it must have done something wrong, that assumption does not come from evidence. It comes from expectation. Collins inhaled slowly, the truth of the statement difficult to ignore now that the situation had unfolded in front of him. "You are right," he said quietly. Angela nodded once, acknowledging the honesty in his response. A city bus passed at the far end of the block, the sound of its engine fading as it turned the corner. The moment had grown quieter, more reflective. Collins glanced toward the Mercedes again and then back at Angela Brooks. "I have worked this district for 8 years," he said, "and I have handled hundreds of stops." Angela listened carefully. "But this one will stay with me," he added. Angela gave a small, thoughtful smile. "That is often how the most important lessons arrive." Collins nodded again, the seriousness of the moment still present in his expression. "I meant what I said earlier," he continued. "I will remember it." Angela reached toward the door handle and gently pulled the door closed this time, the soft click of the latch sounding almost final. The interior of the Mercedes felt cool compared to the warm air outside. Collins took a step back from the car to give her room. For a moment neither of them spoke. The city carried on around them with the quiet confidence of a place that had seen countless moments like this before. Angela rolled the window down halfway and looked at him one last time before preparing to drive away. "Officer Collins," she said calmly, "the law exists to protect fairness. Not just for some people. For everyone." Collins nodded slowly, the words settling deeply in his mind. "I understand." Angela shifted the car into drive, but before she pressed the accelerator she paused again and added one final thought. Sometimes the strongest authority is the ability to admit when something could have been handled better. Collins stood there for a moment longer, watching the Mercedes begin to move forward slowly into the flow of traffic. The car merged smoothly with the vehicles passing along the street, and soon disappeared around the corner of the block. The street returned to its ordinary pace as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet as Officer Derek Collins turned back toward his patrol car, the quiet lesson from that encounter remained firmly in his thoughts, reminding him that the badge he wore carried not only power, but responsibility every single time he stepped onto the street. Officer Derek Collins remained standing beside his patrol car for several seconds after the Mercedes disappeared around the corner. The street had returned to its ordinary rhythm, the earlier tension dissolving into the constant motion of a busy Atlanta afternoon. A delivery truck rumbled past at 30 miles per hour, a cyclist crossed the intersection, and the quiet murmurs of the small crowd that had watched the stop faded into the background as people resumed their routines. Yet for Collins, the moment had not simply ended when the car drove away. He walked slowly back toward his cruiser, the sound of his boots against the pavement echoing faintly in his ears. When he opened the driver's door, he paused before sitting down, looking across the dashboard at the steering wheel and the quiet radio mounted beside it. The patrol car suddenly felt smaller than it had earlier in the day. Collins finally sat down and closed the door, the soft thud sealing him inside the vehicle. For a moment, he did not start the engine. Instead, he replayed the encounter in his mind from the very beginning. The flashing lights. The assumption that the car did not belong to the person driving it. The certainty he had carried when he first stepped out onto the street. Each moment returned clearly now, but with a different meaning than it had held before. Collins rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel and looked out through the windshield toward the street ahead. Somewhere in the distance, the Mercedes was already several blocks away, moving through traffic like any other car on the road. But the conversation that had taken place beside that vehicle had left something behind. Collins reached for the radio again and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 24, he said calmly. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "Go ahead, Unit 24. Collins hesitated for a brief second before continuing. "I need to update the log for the earlier stop." The vehicle was cleared. The stop resulted from a mistaken match to the initial description. The dispatcher acknowledged the update and logged the report without further questions. Collins released the radio button and sat quietly again. The official record would show the stop had been resolved, but the lesson from the encounter would not appear in any report. Outside the windshield, the afternoon sunlight had begun to soften as the sun lowered slightly over the skyline. Collins watched a pedestrian cross the street ahead of him. Then he turned the key in the ignition and started the engine. The patrol car hummed quietly to life. Yet he did not pull away immediately. Instead, he sat there for another moment, thinking about the words Angela Brooks had spoken before she left. Protect fairness for everyone. The phrase repeated in his mind with a clarity that felt impossible to ignore. Collins had spent years wearing the badge on his chest, believing that responsibility alone defined the role of a police officer. But the encounter had revealed something deeper than responsibility. It had revealed how easily certainty could replace curiosity, and how quickly assumptions could shape decisions before the facts had a chance to speak. Collins finally placed the patrol car into gear and eased back into traffic, merging smoothly into the flow of vehicles moving down Peachtree Street. As he drove past the corner where the stop had taken place, he glanced briefly toward the curb where Angela Brooks had stood beside her car. The spot looked completely ordinary now, just another piece of pavement in a city filled with thousands of similar moments. But Collins knew that he would remember that location every time he passed it. Because sometimes a single encounter does more than change a conversation. Sometimes it changes the way a person looks at every decision that follows. The patrol car continued down the street, disappearing into the steady movement of Atlanta traffic, while the quiet lesson from that afternoon traveled with the officer who had learned it. 3 weeks later, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the steps of the Fulton County Justice Center, the tall glass doors reflecting the movement of people entering and leaving the building with the quiet rhythm of another busy workday. Angela Brooks walked through the lobby with the calm focus of someone accustomed to the weight of responsibility that came with her position. The sound of shoes across polished marble floors echoed softly while attorneys, clerks, and visitors moved through the corridors carrying folders and briefcases filled with the ordinary work of the justice system. For Angela, however, the events from that afternoon on Peachtree Street had not disappeared the moment she drove away. Moments like that had a way of lingering long after the traffic lights changed and the city returned to its normal pace. She stepped into her office overlooking the downtown skyline and placed her files neatly on the desk before walking toward the window. From several stories above the street, she could see the steady movement of Atlanta below, cars passing through intersections, pedestrians crossing sidewalks, and police cruisers weaving quietly through the flow of traffic. Each of those vehicles carried someone making decisions in real time, decisions that could affect the lives of strangers in ways they might not fully realize. Angela rested her hands lightly on the edge of the desk as she thought about the conversation she had shared with Officer Derek Collins. She had not filed a complaint. She had not called the department or demanded an investigation. Instead, she had chosen to allow the moment to speak for itself. Because sometimes accountability begins with awareness rather than punishment. That same afternoon, several miles away, Officer Collins sat in a small briefing room at the precinct alongside a group of fellow officers finishing their shift reports. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a steady glow across the room, while the quiet hum of computers filled the background. Collins had already completed the paperwork documenting the stop, carefully noting the error that had led to the mistaken vehicle match. The official report had been straightforward, but the meaning behind it remained far more personal. One of the other officers looked up from his desk and asked casually, "Long day?" Collins gave a small nod. "Educational," he replied. The other officer raised an eyebrow with curiosity, but Collins simply returned to reviewing his report. Some lessons were difficult to explain in a few sentences. They had to be experienced in order to be understood. Later that evening, Collins stepped outside the precinct as the sky shifted into the soft colors of early dusk. The city air carried the distant sound of traffic and the quiet movement of people finishing their day. As he walked toward his patrol car, he paused for a moment, looking down at the badge pinned to his uniform. The metal reflected the fading sunlight in a small glint of gold. That badge had always represented authority, responsibility, and the promise to serve the public. But after that afternoon, it also carried another meaning. It carried a reminder that justice did not begin with power. It began with fairness. Across the city, Angela Brooks closed her office door and prepared to head home for the evening. The skyline outside her window glowed with the last light of the setting sun. She gathered her belongings and paused for a moment before turning off the lights. In a city as large as Atlanta, countless encounters happened every single day, many of them forgotten almost immediately. But some moments quietly reshaped the people involved in ways no report could fully describe. As the building lights dimmed and the evening settled across the city, two people who had met briefly beside a busy street carried the same lesson forward in different directions. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a story is not the conflict that begins it, but the understanding that follows. And in a world where authority can